These are the tools that you'll need to get started warping a rigid Heddle loom. Some fiber, some warp fiber, a measuring tape, some shuttles, a sleigh hook, a scissors, a darning needle, and of course a pattern. The pattern that I'm using is for a sampler, and the size that I need to warp is 6.5. So I'm going to measure 3¼ inches on either side of the middle string and then mark it with a yarn. This way I'm going to know just how much I have to warp, and I don't have to count the heddles all the time. Now these strings are just to help you in the warping, and after you've done warping you can of course trim them off. The important thing about warping on a rigid heddle is determining what's the front of the loom and what's the back of the loom. I'm standing at the back of the loom where we're going to be wrapping the fiber around. The fiber is going to go from the rod through the heddle to the chair. Now a lot of people use a warping peg, but today I've got a chair that I'm going to use. So the next thing we want to do is take some of our fiber and we're going to tie it from underneath the back beam onto the warping rod. You can just tie that in a simple knot. So that's attached there. Then I'm going to use my sleigh hook. As you can see, it has a hook on one end, and a wire loop on the other end. The wire loop is used mostly for reeds that have really small holes that you can't get the hook through. So I've got my fiber on the floor in a bowl, so when it rolls around, it doesn't chase all over the house. And I like to use rubber bands to secure my rod back here, just to make it easier so it doesn't flop around. And those two will come off. As you can see, it's going to hold it straight up. So then I'm going to take my fiber, stick my Heddle sleigh hook. As you can see, there's a little hook on the end. I'm just going to loop it around. I'm going to pull it through, and I'm going to walk it all the way back, and I'm going to walk it all the way back to this chair. Now the distance between the chair and this rod should be the length of the project that I'm working on. And looking at my pattern, it says I need 50 inches. So let's just check to see if I have 50 inches. And I do, I have 50 inches. So I can proceed. Now coming back, this time the warp is going to go under that rod. I'm going to still stick the hook through there, loop it around, and pull it through. And repeat. You'll notice that one pass the thread, the warp yarn comes over the back beam, and one pass it goes under. But it's just a repetition. Now I'm going to remove the rubber bands because the yarn is holding it up. And you can see close up, there are 2 fibers in each one. And this is when you want to check to make sure that you've hit every slot and you haven't missed one. Looks pretty good. So now the next step is rolling the warp onto the back beam. I'm going to cut the marking yarns off just to make it easier for you to see. I'm going to kind of straighten this out a little bit. When you're rolling your warp on the back beam, you always want to have some kind of paper, whether it's craft paper, a grocery bag. I like to use corrugated paper. It just seems to roll really nicely. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the back end of the warp off the chair. Winding it toward the back beam, winding it on. This is kind of a two-person job if you've got an extra set of hands around. The point being that you need to keep it taut so you create good tension in your warp. So as a beginner, it's always helpful to have an extra set of hands. But as the warp comes around here, you want to protect it from all the bumps of all the parts of the loom by sticking some cardboard or corrugated paper in. So once you get it started, now you can stand on the side of the loom, just turn it slowly, keeping the warp tight. It's important to keep it tight. Make sure your lock is in place so when you do stop, and of course mine keeps falling off. And you want to leave about this much at the end because we are going to work with this tail. Once you get it wound on the back beam, you want to make sure that all the fiber is on your paper evenly and it's not slipping off the edge. And then I'm going to kind of comb this out with my hands and I'm going to cut the end off. So I'm basically cutting the loops off and now I have free ends. And now we're going to move one of the threads from the slots into the holes. Now you get a better view of how the yarn is so far. You see I have 2 threads in each slot. So the next process is to move 1 thread from each group of 2 into the hole next to it. You can either start on the left and pull it through the hole or the right. The important thing is to do it the same all the way across. I'm going to go to the left. So I'm going to stick my heddle hook in, catch it, and just gently pull it through the hole. So now I have 1 in the hole and 1 in the slot. Move on to the next one. One in the hole, 1 in the slot. And you do that all the way across. And we're at the last one. This is when it's important to check your work. Kind of comb it out with your hands to straighten out the fibers. And this is where you can see if you've done it properly. We have a thread in each of the holes, except one. I missed one right here, but no problem. Looking back, I can see that I just missed moving one from the slot to the hole. So problem corrected very easily. So now we have all the holes, and if I separate, you can see that I've got one in each slot. So on to the next step. Now it's time to tie the warp onto the heddle rod. I'm going to divide the fibers into bunches of 4. 2 on the top, 2 in the holes, and 2 in the bottom. So I have 2 here and 2 down here. 2 here, 2 down here. So I have 2 bunches. I'm going to wrap it around the rod like this. And then I'm going to do an overhand knot. Just one knot. Pull it tight, and I'm going to make a bow. I'm doing the bow because it's easy to readjust as you go along. By inserting some, this is called waste yarn. In other words, it's not part of your pattern. It's just going to facilitate spreading the warp. So I'm putting our heddle in the down position. It's creating a shed. I'm going to slip the shuttle through the shed. Just going to put it in loosely, leave a tail on the end. Then I'm going to change the heddle, the reed, into the up position, and bring the shuttle through from the other side. I'm going to do this about 3 times. Just leaving it loosely. I'm not beading at this time. Okay, now I've got 3 passes in there. Now I'm going to bring the reed toward me gently. This is called beading. And you can see how it's starting to spread the warps to a more even position. So we're going to repeat that a couple more times until they're evenly spaced. And it makes a good foundation for our weaving. I'm bringing the yarn all the way over to the edge here, and I'm going to change the reed to the down position. And you can see how it's starting to spread. We still have a little bit of space. I'm going to do it one more series. Putting the reed back in neutral, and now you can see we've spread it. Now we're ready to start our project. So let's start the real weaving. Heddle is in neutral. We're going to put it in the up position to open the shed. Now we're going to bring the yarn through. We're We're going to hold it, cinch it at the side here, and leave it at an angle or in a bubble, whichever you prefer. This creates enough extra yarn so when the yarn goes between the warp threads, it doesn't pull the sides in. Then we're going to beat by pressing carefully against the previous row. Then in the downshed and repeat. If you set your yarn nicely at the edge by pinching it, you're going to get nice edges. The reason you want to set the yarn at the edge is so you don't end up with a piece hanging over on the edge like this. The hardest thing about being a beginning weaver is keeping your edges straight. So you don't want to get into the habit of pulling too hard like this. As you can see, the edge pulls in. That's why we want to do the bubble. So if you pinch the yarn just above the previous pick, you're going to have a nice edge. And of course, it does take practice. The pattern that I'm going to be using today is a sampler of many different types of weaves. So it encourages you to use multiple colors. So I'm going to wrap my shuttles with the colors that I'm going to be using in my project. I'm going to start by, some shuttles have a little slot in them like this, where you can anchor your yarn. Others don't, so you just wrap it around like this. So you're going to kind of do a figure 8 kind of motion. And I'm doing 10 passes on this side. Then I'm going to turn the shuttle over and do 10 wraps on this side. And then 10 in the middle. And the reason we do it this way is to keep the yarn spread across the shuttle so it doesn't get too thick on the sides, as you can see, because the shed that you're going to be putting it through isn't very big, so you don't want a big overload of yarn. And I'm going to repeat with the next color. If you're working with a pattern that has multiple colors on the shuttle, sometimes it's helpful to actually mark them. So I'm marking mine shuttle 2, shuttle 1, and shuttle 3. So when I'm reading my pattern, I won't be confused. This is just waste paper. We're ready to start our sampler. I'm going to start with color number 1, and I'm going to finish this edge as I start with some hem stitching. So I want to allow enough extra yarn to do the stitching. So you want to allow at least 3 times the width of your project. So 1, 2, 3. I'm going to add a little extra. So I'm going to start my weaving with this long tail. So I'm putting the fiber through. I've got this long tail over here to do my sewing with. I'm going to beat, close the shed, and the pattern says do 20 picks or 20 passes. So this is pass number 2. And I'm setting the edge, leaving it at angle, beating, repeat. I'm finding that my weaving space is getting very short here, so now it's time to advance the warp. So I'm going to release the back break, move it forward slightly, and then start winding the front around. Release it a bit. So now my weaving is closer to me. So I'm in neutral when I did that. So now I'm going to go back in the up shed and resume weaving. As you can see, I have a lot more space here. When you're weaving in this part of the loom, it makes your shed over here, your opening for your shuttle, a little bit bigger. We're going to take the tail that we left and thread it into like a darning size needle. A needle that isn't real sharp but has a big enough eye to get your yarn through. And I'm going to do my hem stitching in groups of 4. So I'm going to count 4 over, come up from underneath, and then go up 2 threads. And what it does is it pulls the base into a little bunch. Gonna go down through this hole, under 4, down again, and up 2. Down where I came up, under 4, and again, and up 2. You see it's making a nice little finish edge here. Under 4. There's other ways to finish your edge. There's a product that's on the market that's made by Eileen's, which is a sewing company. That's like a glue that you can run a bead of this product across here, and when it's dry it'll keep all these threads together. But if you don't do a finish on this edge of some kind, when you take it off the loom it'll start to unravel. There's also several types of hem stitching. This is just one. You're going to do this hem stitching on the other end of your project when you finish weaving the whole project too. My pattern called for one more color of yarn called an inclusion yarn, which can be anything natural or just a splash of color that you want to add in. So I'm going to add that now. It says just one pick. So by inserting the one shuttle, I just have one color here. Just going to be one pass of this. And so what I'm going to do is wrap the yarn around the outside edge and back in on itself just to anchor it. Then I'm going to do that on the other side as well. direction is weave 2 picks of the weft color, color number 1, and that's the same, that's the brown. So I'm gonna, 1 pass is 1 pick. Two picks. And now the instructions are to weave color number 2, 10 picks. This was color number 2. So I'm going to include that the same way I did the multicolor piece, just at the selvage. Now I still have this other yarn here, so I want to make sure I'm going to include that because I'm going to come back to that. So I'm going to pass it through the loop on the side. That way it'll, the burgundy color will just carry the brown up the side. That's 2. Now I'm going to have to carry the brown again. Four. 5. 6. 7. 8. 9. I'm still carrying the brown up the side. Now I'm going to alternate the colors. So the brown color, and then a burgundy color. One of each. And I still have to include the brown by looping it in. If you have problems with your reed falling like that, it's probably because your tension isn't quite tight enough. You see how I've looped the burgundy around the brown? And you're always going to put your shuttle through with the yarn as the tail. That way, if you need to unwrap more while you're going through, it's easy to do. So now the burgundy has to go around the brown. I find if I lay the shuttle I'm not using on the other side of the reed, it gives you a little better control of where everything is. So now this is just going to go over the brown. See how that's catching right there on the edge? Now we're going to move on to the border by using color number 3. We're going to use 3 picks of this. Before we add that in, I think we're going to delete the brown, color number 1. So So when I do that, I want to just tuck it back in the next shed, just over a couple of threads. Then I'm going to add in color number 3. And we're going to do 3 picks of color number 3. Same way in the end. Just going to wrap it around the outside yarn and tuck it in like that. Now we want to carry the burgundy up with the gray, so we want to bring it through the loop. You see how it just runs up the side? So that's our 3 picks of gray, and now 1 pick of burgundy. And 3 picks of gray. And we've created a pattern right there. We're going to have to advance the warp because our weaving space has gotten small. So you're going to put your heddle in neutral, release the back break, advance some fiber, and then tighten it on the front. The next pattern calls for 5 picks of 1 and 2 picks of 2, and no picks of color number 3. So we're going to cut this one off, secure the tail, five picks of color number 1. Color number 1 was the brown. Now 2 picks of color number 2. Switching fibers, 2 picks of color number 2. I'll just finish this section by doing a border that matches this one. Well, that completes section number 1 of plain weave and plain weave variations with alternating colors. Join me in the next section and I'll show you how to do clasped weft.